everyone. What a wonderful crowd. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books on Magic. So we are so excited to have Jaime Green and Leslie Jamison with us to celebrate the launch of Jamie's newest book, The Possibility of Life. But before we get into all of that, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, we do ask that you remain masked while in store at tonight's event. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Jaime will be signing and personalizing books at the little alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of The Possibility of Life online using the link in the live stream description. All right, let's get into this. So this book is for anyone who likes to look up at the sky at night and wonder what else might be out there. Jaime Green takes us on a journey through the cosmos, interweaving science history and science fiction to explore the origins and evolution of life and ask what it truly means to be human. Jaime Green is a science writer, essayist, and editor. She is the series editor of the Best American Science and Nature Writing and is a lecturer at Smith College. Her writing has appeared in Slate, Popular Science, New York Times Book Review, Catapult, Astrobites, and elsewhere. And as I mentioned earlier, Leslie Jamison joins Jaime in conversation tonight. Leslie is the author of the New York Times bestsellers The Recovering and the Empathy Exams and the novel The Gin Closet. She is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and directs the graduate nonfiction program at Columbia University. All right, that's all from me. Without any further delay, please join me in giving Jaime and Leslie a very warm welcome.
Live stream. I always watch book events from the live stream because I live in Connecticut, so I'm just like, I get you.
Hi, Jaime.
Hi.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's really exciting.
Thank
The
you.
book is coming out. This is really wonderful.
Yeah, and like every person I've ever known in my life is here. So I'm going to start by reading a little. Okay. This is from the last chapter, but I don't think there's anything that you need to know. No, you're good. All right. The golden record is the richest message humanity has ever sent into the cosmos. Messages in a bottle that were attached to the Voyager probes that left Earth in 1977. They were devised by a committee led by Carl Sagan over the course of a few months. The record's cover contains clues to its origin and instructions for playing the record, converting the etched grooves on its surface into images and sound. The images include scientific diagrams and photographs of the Arecibo telescope, of a mother breastfeeding, of a woman standing in front of a supermarket produce display, eating a grape she likely hasn't yet paid for. The sounds include over 24 works of music, greetings in 55 languages, and recordings of thunder, wind, trains, automobiles, heartbeats, and whale song. There's also an hour-long recording of Andrean's brainwaves, taken as she meditated on the history of humanity, its current struggles, and a personal statement of what it was like to fall in love. Druyan and Sagan fell in love during the 6 months of the record's creation, but that wasn't the only romance. She speaks as lovingly of the golden record as she does of Sagan. She told me, "One of the reasons I have such an emotional attachment to Voyager is it is one of those occasions for human self-esteem. It hurt no one, and yet in every way it exceeds the most ambitious expectations of its makers. It is that great place where our brains, our souls, our hearts, and our music combined in one work of art and science. The Voyagers will be circumnavigating the Milky Way for the next 1 billion to 5 billion years, up to 10 orbits of the galactic center. But Druyan knows, as everyone working on the record knew at the time, that the odds of either spacecraft being found out in space are infinitesimally small. It was in so many ways a project for humans, a mirror to hold up to ourselves to say, this is who we are. Music and whale song and the laughter of children, the brainwaves of a woman newly in love, so in love that it colored even her meditation on the great suffering of a planet. But infinitesimally small odds are still something. Druyan told me, with the probability of more than zero over 5 billion years, she leaned toward me and smiled as she held up her hand. 2 spacecraft? That's double the odds. You start to get into that neighborhood of, well, it's possible. She leaned back with a small smile and a shrug. She told me she's imagined that possibility playing out 1 trillion times. The extraterrestrial finding a Voyager, decoding its schematic, setting the record to play. And then she wonders, what could the sound essay mean to them? As for imagining who might find the record, Druyan told me, the eons it takes for nature and the environment and mutation to sculpt life is so splendid that when I'm yearning to see the extraterrestrial, I think it's going to be the way I felt when I first laid eyes on my 2 babies. That sense of course that's what you look like. You're so beautiful. That makes perfect sense. Could I have imagined you into being? No. And that's how I think we'll feel when we actually finally do, in some shape or form, make contact. That sense of, oh yes, of course. But not that we have the wherewithal to imagine it.
It's wonderful to hear a bit of the book in your voice, and I'm glad actually that you chose that particular passage, both because I find its content moving, but also because I feel like it gets at so beautifully the ways in which so much of this, so much of what you're documenting in the book about people imagining through art, through science, and through speculation, what alien life might look like, what it might look like to be in contact with alien life. So much of that process of imagining and putting the work towards connecting is actually also a way of reevaluating what does it mean to be human, what's important about human life, how can we think about consciousness in more expansive terms than just human life might invite us to do. And so I thought we could start there as a way of, getting some traction in what this book is. There were a couple of moments in the beginning that I thought expressed really eloquently some of the questions that this book holds. When you write, thinking about who might be out there was a way of thinking about the possibilities of existence and how humans fit into all of it, and really connected to the golden record. Our visions of space are a reflection of ourselves and of our humanity. And I wondered if you could just kind of talk a little bit about how both imagining aliens and sort of writing the human attempt to imagine aliens is a way of thinking about humanity itself and various conceptions of what human life is.
Yeah, I feel like in science fiction there are like 2 kinds of aliens. I mean, like, sentient, intelligent aliens. There are the aliens who are totally opaque, where like the point of them is to show how alien an alien could be. Like the heptapods in Arrival is probably the one that's most familiar to everyone, where it's just, and they're even more mysterious and weird in the short story that the movie's based on, where it's like they come, they talk a little, and then they just leave, and they had no, you don't even know why they came. Or like in Solaris, the ocean being is just like completely indecipherable, and and then the stories, the fiction becomes about the people trying to interact with that like alien presence. But then there are a lot of stories where the alien is just another kind of person. In like classic sci-fi, it's like a bug person or a lizard person. Or in Star Trek, it's, a logical person or an aggressive person or a greedy person, right? And we're just like the normal ones in the middle, unfortunately, for better or worse. And so, there are also like more complicated, nuanced ways of doing that. And it really feels like ways of testing out, like, how could a person be beyond the ways that a person is on Earth? So, like, you know, we have all the variety among humanity that we have in terms of culture, in terms of personality, and all of that. And what if we expand a little farther? And so it's a way of coming up with like a broader, more expansive version of what the category of person is. And sometimes it's also about like how far can you stretch that before you become something else.
Well, and I wonder, I think that is so helpful, that kind of these two categories of like alien as, you know, representation of utter opacity, and alien as like human with like weird forehead ridge or something like that. I mean, not to diminish the second category, but I wonder whether you could, it struck me that some of the sci-fi imaginings of aliens that you profile here and kind of take us into and analyze a bit they sort of exist in a middle space, and maybe an even more interesting middle space, where they're neither like alien as total otherness nor alien as, you know, human with a few different accessories, but actually in some kind of uncanny valley where it's like it is consciousness in some recognizable way, but there's something destabilizing about it. And I wonder if you could introduce us to a few of the aliens that like kind of live in that breaking down the binary zone.
No, totally, because those are some of the most like exciting to read, because that's when you're like really stretching your empathy and your imagination. And so the first one that comes to mind is Embassy Town by China Miéville, where it's set in, when I finished that book, I was like, how are there not 12 other books set in this universe? Because there's this like, you get this huge sense of the universe, and you know, there are lots of different kinds of aliens, and the humans talk about how there are some alien species with whom the humans share, I think it's a conceptual map, where it's like they're like similar enough in how they experience or view the world that they can like, you know, they're like on the same page. And then there are aliens who are not. And then the sort of main alien species in that book are really like right in the middle. And I write about this book in terms of language, because the alien species, they're called, the planet is Arieka, so they're the Ariekine. I just learned how to say all these things for the audiobook, and I'm like trying to remember it. They have a language that is impossible for a single human to speak. They have like two different vocalizing organs, and they speak like two tracks at the same time. But it's not just that, because like when the humans met them, they had, you know, their translator software, and they would push play on a computer and two sounds would come out, and the aliens just did not act like anything was even being said until a couple of linguists in frustration each shouted half of like the greeting word, and the aliens were like, ooh, I didn't know there was anyone there. Because for them, the idea is that language isn't representative. It's a direct conduit to the truth. So like they can't lie. And so there has to be a mind behind the words, which was why the computer talking didn't work. And so I'm realizing that like that, and the other example I was thinking of, which is Semiosis by Sue Burke, which is about a sentient plant, to like wildly oversimplify things. But she really thinks about like, what would a sentient plant be like? Over the course of both of those books, the very like incomprehensible alien becomes slightly more comprehensible, and that's like such a pleasure reading, where you're like, oh my gosh, I can sort of understand what's going on in there.
Yeah, well, and it strikes me that there's also, not to be reductive or bombastic about it, but there is a bit of an ethical spark or charge or electricity or something in refusing to have a creature who is either completely opaque or completely legible. It's asking you to both respect the opacity and what's not totally knowable, but also not to kind of almost use that as a by doing exactly what you're saying, of sort of opening up that opacity a little bit. It's also saying you don't get to just say, oh, this is totally other, totally unknowable, totally, impossible to engage with. There's actually a way. I was so interested by Semiosis, which is not a book that I've read, but one of the great...
It's really good.
Well,
it's really good.
One of the great pleasures of your book is it sort of feels like sitting in a bar with somebody who's like, you have to read this, and then you have to read this, and then you have to watch this, and then you have to do this, and I'm like, yes, yes, yes. But you also are generous even without having read or consumed so many of these things, they're still completely, there were some of them where I was like, I think it's possible that I might prefer Jamie's version of this to the actual, but I was really interested in semiosis, and also that moment where you described the book turning towards the POV of the plant, and maybe this is just every writerly geeky molecule in me was like, oh, the POV of the plant, like amazing. But that feels like an instance of what you're talking about.
Oh yeah, because that's like within the realm of fiction, saying like this is a person, like he gets an eye, and he uses he pronouns because he gets named after a human with a male name, but like the plant is hermaphroditic, right? But yeah, that he has a point of view and he has that consciousness and self-awareness to say, I think like the first part is, he says like, I grow towards the sun. Like he's like, he's aware of himself and what he does. And in Solaris, which is one of the big, like, completely unknowable alien stories, there's even the humans don't know if that alien entity is self-aware or if what they're seeing from it is just like reflexes. They have no idea.
Well, and I wonder if you could take us back. I mean, it's a pleasure to speak to you about this stuff because the like animated energy you bring to it is so present in each of your words, but I wonder if you could take us back to some of the origin stories you give us in the book for some of your own interest in aliens. I'm thinking about both Star Trek and Madeline L'Engle, and what both of the kind of conceptions of alien life that you received at it was 8,
like 7 or 8 years old.
Yeah,
I think it was probably right around the same age that that my dad first put on Star Trek: The Next Generation. So my sister's here, and I've like tried to do the math, and my dad doesn't remember, but I think it was around season 3, so I would have been 7 or 8, which means that you were like 4 or 5. I don't know. It's not inappropriate. It's probably just boring. And then right around the same age, I read A Wrinkle in Time for the first time. And both of those, they offer like very hopeful visions of the cosmos. Like in A Wrinkle in Time, it's about love. It's about like love literally like winning the day, like that's the main character's superpower. And Star Trek, especially Next Generation, like at first it feels a lot more reserved, less emotional, it's like everyone's just walking around in their little tight uniforms and stuff. But Star Trek offers a very loving world where like the Earth is post-war, post-scarcity, post-poverty, socialist, right? My Star Trek expert fact checker is in the front row. I can't get it wrong in front of Molly. And that peacefulness is really hopeful. And it's like, okay, if you've conquered all the major problems on Earth, what do? You go out into space and you meet everyone else who's there and you try to help them solve their problems. And like, I think, would you say Next Generation is the most pacifist Star Trek?
Yes.
Yeah, right? Because like DS9 hinges on a lot of conflict. All the new ones are just like pew, pew, pew. But they never want to fight on Next Generation. They're like just doing it to help people or in self-defense. And that I think is very like, even though it's not an effusive love, it is still a very loving vision of space and aliens, and they just want to be friends, and they all work together. And I think that like that was what I really connected with, that it wasn't a more like aggressive, conflict-based kind of sci-fi.
Well, and I wonder, I mean, just thinking about the kind of emotional forces at play in encountering those early conceptions of both alien life, but also what human impulses might drive a certain kind of contact with alien life. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, the kind of process of arriving at the concept of this book, both in terms of, the kind of emotional or dimensions of what like drove you, what obsessed you, what did you feel really passionate about, and then I have some questions about how you kind of figured out how to structure it and how to
because it was a conversation with you. That's cheating. But no, yeah. So it's so funny because this is like, you know, Jamie, this is your life. Like there are people here from like every step of this. So I had always loved science and sci-fi. Like I have a tattoo from the Golden Record on my leg, which I got before any of this started. That's the pulsar map. But it started in grad school. I was getting my MFA in creative nonfiction. My very first semester in workshop, my professor mentioned, oh, there's a group on campus. It's like a science writing workshop group for scientists and writers. And I was like, wait a second. I love science. I've always loved science. I love writing. Why am I not writing about science? And so I started going to this group. And then the next semester, everyone in the nonfiction program had to do a research seminar where I think they really have that to like pull the memoirists just out a little bit. It's like you have to write about something else. But I was not a memoirist anyway. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to write about the Golden Record. And my professor said, go bigger, right? Just write about aliens. I was like, that's a lot bigger, as the book proves, where like every chapter could, for better or worse, be its own book of just like what it covers. But I started writing it then, and I also at the same time took an undergrad class in the astronomy department, and started actually learning the science of exoplanets and astrobiology. And I loved it. I loved writing about it. I started workshopping bits of it in that science writing group. This is like 10, 11 years ago. And but then I would go to the bookstore. I remember going to Housing Works and going upstairs to the science shelf and just be like, I'm going to visit where my future book about aliens would be. And there were already books about aliens on the shelf, and they were written by scientists. And I was like, no, this book exists too much. And I was like, well, I don't know. Like, what do I just have an MFA. And so I put it away for a while. And then a few years later, a friend was doing some editing for Medium, like 8 incarnations of Medium ago. And she asked if I had any ideas for an essay series for their culture section. And I was like, what about aliens through a cultural lens? And she said yes, which was amazing. And then it was like the second essay I was writing I was like, I'll write about like sci-fi versions of aliens and science versions of aliens. And I just felt like I could keep going. And that turned into part of chapter 3. Because that's when I was like, oh, I have a lot to say. And this is a different way of writing this book. Looking at how we imagine alien life. Because what I realized, and like that feeling of I could keep going, is like, oh, this is the interesting way for me to write about it. Not as like, what are the facts? What's the science? What do we know? Yes or no? Maybe not. How are we going to find them? But as I write in the book, like, the question to me is, what if? Like, how do we imagine them? What do those imaginings tell us? And it like opens up into more possibilities rather than trying to narrow down until we get to the right answer.
Well, so much to say. And it's fascinating also to hear the ways that a book project and a series of passions, or a sort of trajectory of following passion, is always shaped by institutions and groups. And I feel like there's a way that sometimes when we talk about writing, there can be a pressure to not talk about that part of things, to act as if one's relationship to one's subject is some kind of divine transmission, right, from like the Golden Record of the muse of where books come from or something. It's like, but it doesn't work like that. It's more interesting because it doesn't work like that.
Well, and because you need constraints. Like, I'm teaching a writing class now that's like starting with structure, because it's like when you have the structural rules and constraints, that helps you figure out, like, that gives you something to start with. Otherwise you just have a blank page and it's like, I don't know, and so I think that the constraints of like both the inspiration of like, here's a science writing group, and I was like, oh, you can write about science? Huh. But then also the constraints of that research seminar, where it was like, pick something that you will research. So it has to be something that you can like library research, not even reporting, and you have to write about it. And so it's like, okay, that's like such a narrow assignment, but then that gives you, it's sort of like, not a funnel, but it like, in narrowing, it sort of concentrates the flow of inspiration. Does that make sense? It's like if it's wind.
Yeah.
Like blowing through a straw. I don't know.
I'm just gonna keep nodding because my knowledge of science is. I'm like,
no, it's not
totally
even science.
right.
There's just like there's a metaphor that I'm going for that I'm not getting. But you guys, okay. The science writers and editors are nodding, so I got their approval.
Well, and I also think that something about the structure of this book to me both feels so intuitive and so kind of it's juicier to be able to bring in these actual narrative imaginings of aliens, but it also suggests what I think is a really true way of thinking about the relationship between humanities and science, which is like both are questing towards knowledge and often reckoning with shared or overlapping questions, but just doing it in very different ways and from very different angles, as opposed to thinking, okay, the literary criticism version of exploring this question has to live here on the shelf, and then the science history or science journalism version of exploring this question has to live over here. Of course they could live together in the same book, but you had to come along to make that book. So.
And it does like practice, we're talking about grad school, so like on the practicalities of publishing, that does make it harder to sell. Like I remember when I met my editor, one question I had for him was like, what shelf do you envision this on? Because I wasn't sure. And it was like a weird in-between book. And like I always understood it, but it was really hard to communicate that to people because like when you write a nonfiction book, you sell it with a book proposal. You don't write the book first. And so I had to be like, here's what the book's going to be, and then convince people, which was hard because it's an in-between sort of book.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, my favorite kind.
I know, me too, but tell that to the people with the money.
And so once you knew that you wanted the book to include a consideration of human attempts to understand or imagine or speculate about alien life, both drawing from science and literature and film, how did you kind of figure out what that would actually look like? I'm not doing the thing.
Well, because it was a conversation that we had. But so I had written the essays.
You did a lot of the figuring out.
I did a lot of it. Was just a little So I had written the series of essays for Medium, and so when I was writing my book proposal, luckily I had that raw material. I didn't have to write all new stuff. But it was tricky to figure out because when I started writing what would be like the very first version of chapter 3, it came out with a lot more science than I expected. I think I had thought that this would be more of an essay, literary nonfiction book, which I think it still has, but it's a science book. And maybe that was like not like sort of like underestimating myself as a science writer, that like I was like, oh, I'm writing a science book, not just like a book with some science in it. Like, because I needed more time to explore that, and it was really interesting. Like, describing what a little background monkey in Avatar looks like is fine, but exploring evolutionary biology and the idea of whether we would expect evolution on another planet to work like evolution here, that's more interesting than Avatar, And so in some ways it was like discovering the book as I wrote it, but then there was the question of like, what is the relationship between the science and the sci-fi, and how do I move between them, and like what serves what? And that's why I'm laughing, because we were on a bench in Prospect Park, and it was about the little Avatar monkey part. And part of it was that you suggested that you helped me realize that the sci-fi scenes could be the scenes in the book, because I don't do the like science journalism thing of the chapter opens and we're in a lab and you meet a colorful character. It's like a researcher wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and then I hold the bug that they're studying, and then I tell you about the bug research. And I love those kinds of books, but like I was coming out of a creative nonfiction program. I was not a reporter. I'm not a journalist. And so I wasn't going to have those scenes. But 300 pages of just me telling you about science is really boring. And so you helped me realize that, like, I do have scenes, but they're scenes from Semiosis, from Avatar. Like, that's the sort of the narrative moments. And it's like, I don't remember, but like on that park bench was when I figured out that section with the monkey starts like the blue and green monkey that like you sort of like you do like cold opens with the movies and with the books And it's like a way to find that variety. So it's not just me telling you, like, here's some science, here's a book I read, because I also didn't want to just be like, here's some science, here's a book I read. Like, what's the relationship between those two things? And I definitely didn't want it to be, here's a book I read, the science tells us whether or not that's accurate. Because, like, I'm not Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I don't want to be. for many reasons. But, like, no one cares. It's, like, sometimes interesting. And, like, with the Avatar monkey, that's really interesting because what I learned is, so in Avatar, all the animals have 6 legs, right? But the humanoids, the Na'vi, they have 4 limbs. So what is up with that? How did they lose their limbs? Well, James Cameron was watching out for us, and in like a split second in the background, there's a little monkey type character where his like middle limbs and top arms have partway fused. And so, right? James Cameron got it. And so he, for better or for worse. And so he's saying like, don't worry, but if you're a monkey climbing through the trees, why would you lose your extra arms? They would be so useful. I didn't figure this out myself, by the way. It was a paleontologist and educator named Katie Slavensky is the one who pointed this out to me. And then with like all the, dire horses and whatever with their 6 legs, for running animals, they actually evolve towards less contact with the ground. Like horses' hooves are just like one finger, right? So evolutionarily, like James Cameron, he tried, but he got it backwards. And that's why it's interesting, not because it's right or wrong, but because it's a way to, I learned so much about like horses and monkeys and thought about like, how evolution and the ways that animals interact with their environments drives evolution and eventually changes their bodies. And like, that's cooler than Avatar.
Well, and in a way, thank you. What would I do without my
You brought a
science pen? I always like to have a thematically appropriate pen at every event. Yeah, I mean it's so much more interesting than kind of to be in nothing. I love fact checkers and every kind of
I
fact
love my
checker.
fact checkers so much. Rachel,
spiritual fact checkers, every kind of fact checker, but to take on the role of sort of almost like plausibility police or something like that was like so much less interesting than actually thinking about if the true question here is not just a question of kind of scientific accuracy, but really telling the story of human acts of imagining, then in a way, every act of imagining has some information to give us about human conceptions of consciousness and other ways consciousness might look, kind of regardless of how accurately it could map onto some kind of actuality, even though that question of how it would map onto actuality is also interesting. It's like, but you just give both of those angles of inquiry room as opposed to saying, oh, the only thing we can look out for here is whether or not this could actually happen like this. And that allows you to engage so much more nimbly with the fused limb monkeys and everything else that you
and I didn't want to be like in an oppositional stance towards the fiction writers. I mean, maybe James Cameron, but like he can handle it. But like other than Avatar, which is like fine. Every book and everything I write about, all the fiction I write about, just about, is something that I really love. And that felt important to me because when I first started working on the book, I had the idea that the introduction would include like a little caveat of like, if some sci-fi, sorry if your favorite thing's not in here, this is just a little, I'm sure there's, because like I write about maybe like 12 novels. I haven't counted, which is weird. There's no Arthur C. Clarke. And I was like, don't come for me. But then I realized that like the whole book is shaped by how I think about this stuff. And it was important to me that even if something scientifically and thematically really fit, I only wanted to write about it if I also loved it. Because that's just, it comes back to the like Wrinkle in Time stuff. Like I want to be engaging with this stuff from a place of love and curiosity rather than animosity.
Yeah, there's so much. So I want to ask you about animosity. I want to ask you a quick question about monstrosity. And I think we're going to open it up to everybody here, but I'll just signal that so that people can start assembling their questions. So I'll ask you one quick question about monsters. Yes. You cite this, to me, really fascinating idea from Jeffrey Jerome's notion that monsters embody and enforce a culture's anxieties. I was hoping you could talk to us about a monstrous alien and what anxieties they embody. I was immediately trying to imagine my own, if my own anxieties were given monstrous form, what they would look like.
I mean, I first just want to acknowledge, like, because I was winking at Abby back there, that in looking at like all the weird ways that institutions and our lives like shape our ideas. So that essay is an essay that I encountered when I was teaching first year essay writing at Columbia after my MFA. That's Monster Culture 7 Theses by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen. And I adore it, and like I've tried to work it into everything I've written. But it fit in this. I still haven't worked my my Cronin Trouble with Wilderness into a book, but he'll be in the next one. The 3 UW teachers here are getting it. I just had to, but it's this stuff that you encounter that you think about and think about and think about, and it's just sort of, you're carrying it around looking for a home for it. And I was like, aliens are monsters. And he actually, in that essay, talks about the xenomorph in Alien, which I have to admit, I will admit this, I wrote about Alien in the book. I have never seen the movie. It is too scary for me. But so I cite Cohen citing a psychoanalyst writing about why the xenomorph is so disturbing. And I took their word for it. But that's like a perfect example, because, you know, it's like sort of human, but very animal. Like, it works on instinct, but it's very smart. It's sort of insecty and crustacean, but also sort of humanoid. And so in the essay, Cohen talks about how it breaks down these categories that we think of as solid categories. And that's one of the things that feels monstrous to us, when it's like, it's like sort of this, but sort of that. But I mean, on the other hand, we've all seen a duck-billed platypus, right? And that is like, it's got a little duck and it's fuzzy and some webs and it can zap, but it's cute, so it doesn't upset us. But I was really interested in this idea of when the unnaturalness of an alien would be disturbing. And in Octavia Butler's novel Dawn, when her human protagonist first meets an alien, which is like humanoid shaped, but kind of gray and tentacly, but like, there are worse aliens out there. And he's not making any aggressive moves or whatever. Butler describes her as having this like intense revulsion at the unnaturalness. And it's really this sense of like, these creatures from different worlds were not supposed to meet. And it is unnatural. Like, the idea of like, is our sense of what's natural limited to Earth? Or would it extend to something natural from another world? Like, that's one of those unanswerable questions that I just think is fascinating and is imagined in different ways in sci-fi. Like in Star Trek, Klingons and humans can have babies. But in Dawn, just seeing an alien like almost gives her vertigo with how wrong it is.
So interesting. I could ask you questions forever. I'm sure there's so many other questions for you, so bring them on from the room.
Hi, Ariana.
This is like a question, but your enthusiasm is so obvious. I could listen to you talk about it forever. How did you know when the book was done?
The question is, how did I know when the book was done? And the answer was that it was due 6 months ago. And I just like, I sold the book in January 2019 when I was 5 months pregnant. Sorry to my editor. And so then I like went on maternity leave, and then I started writing, and then the pandemic hit, and the book was due, and the due dates really just pushed me. And there was a lot of like, I did have to accept that like I was maybe not going to find the perfect piece of research for every chapter. I was going to find good enough research for every chapter, and a lot of what is in there is shaped by what I found. Like this, I often have been jealous of you because if I'm not wrong, the recovering came out of your dissertation, sort of, right? Yep. And I often wished to have like 5 years of immersive research to really feel like an expert in sci-fi representations of aliens and an expert in 8 different PhDs, but I didn't have that. I think I ended up with about 2 years to research and write the book, and I just had to finish it, and so it was deadlines. Yeah, I mean, I did revise it a lot. I did actually do that. Like, I did. This isn't the first draft, but and so I did when I did. Instead of thinking about like, is this done? I was thinking about like, what is this chapter trying to do? Where is it not working? I like keeping the diagnoses local and sort of more, almost more like observational rather than evaluative. Like, done is never the goal. Cohesive is the goal. Making the point I want to make is the goal. And then it's like, now it's due.
Well, in a way, I mean, for what it's worth, like, I didn't feel at all like an expert after however many years, and I think that in a way, it's like whether it's deadlines or kind of the right frameworks, we all have to make peace with the kind of grieving, the hypothetical, impossible other version of self who sort of knows everything and writes the version of the book that would be possible if we didn't have kids and there were 29
there wasn't a
million hours
pandemic.
Yeah, so we all sort of have to make peace with this is what is. But
I ended up like I do really love this version of it, and like the pandemic meant that I did almost no travel research, so that really meant I couldn't write that science journalist version of things because I couldn't go to the labs. So all the interviews were over Zoom. It was a lot of reading, a lot of conversations, but that meant that it made it more of an essayistic book instead of a science journalism book, because the action is through thinking through all these things, which is like a very pandemic book way to be. But I love that because that's like my roots as a creative nonfiction writer, and it felt true to me instead of trying to pretend to be a science journalist. Sorry. I wrote science journalism for you. I'm so sorry. I'm okay.
Jamie.
Hi, Molly.
If you could meet any fictional alien, what fictional alien, species, or individual would you choose to encounter?
Would you have babies with it?
No, I would not have babies with it. Okay, so the question was, if I could choose to meet any fictional alien or alien species, what would it be? And then a tacked on question was, would I have babies with it? And the answer to that one is no. I don't even know what the species is. Oh gosh, that's really hard. I mean, it has to be Aunt Beast, right? It has to be Aunt Beast from A Wrinkle in Time, because I love her so much. So, and if she could make me feel like warm and loved like she does, like, right? That's okay. That was an easy one. Thank you. Wait, can I call in?
Yeah.
Okay,
Please.
I'll go with you. Hi.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about jargon, because I imagine there's a lot of that in this work. And I was wondering what kind of decisions you had to make on what goes in, what goes out, or do you have any specific stories about something you really wanted to keep, but for maybe pacing reasons you had to exclude?
So the question was about jargon, like scientific jargon, right? And how I dealt with that in writing. I think I mostly tried to avoid jargon. Or if it, I only, anything that was really jargon, I avoided. There are definitely terms I use that are scientific terms, but because they're the only word for that thing, and so then I explain what it is and maybe have a little drawing that explains it. But there are lots of quotes from scientists, lots of interviews. I love bringing their voices into it, but I hope that I was careful to, in the interviews, get them to talk casually like a person, and to choose quotations that are more about like conveying their interest and excitement and the facts of things. And then when they got into jargon, I would paraphrase it and make it a little less jargony, I hope. Yeah. You guys will have to let me know how I did with that. But that's how I approached it. Yeah. Thanks. Josh, you had your hand up, right?
Yeah. It's kind of related to the first question, just because I'm so intrigued of how you go through the process in a situation where you're doing a little bit of like, it's based on fiction, but then speculation, and you're bringing it into a nonfiction realm of like, you mentioned you had to choose like maybe 12 science fiction properties to actually use. And I'm curious, when you're going through the mapping out process of making the book, was it kind of like, what was the process of choosing what did you want to feature versus like, I have to use this, or like I need something to fill this in. And
Yeah.
how do you choose, like, you know, if you had to kill your darlings at all or something?
Yeah. So the question was about how I chose the sci-fi that I was going to write about, and whether there were like some books that I was going to shoehorn in, or when I was like, I need a book about X, let me go find it. It was definitely some of both. So like I shoehorned Ursula Le Guin in here like 4 times because she doesn't write about aliens. All her aliens are like basically people. I love them. I love her. But so she's the epigraph. I work in a Hainish reference for like no reason. There's a reason. But then I found this story about animal languages. And very late in the process, I was like, I have to add 500 words on this Ursula Le Guin story. So like I was like, had my little antennae up looking for a way to bring her in, because she's just so important to me, even though she doesn't totally fit with the book. But then there were definitely, I knew that I needed to find fiction set on planets that were different from Earth, sort of orbitally. So like there's a lot of fiction written about planets that are tidally locked to their stars, which means that just like the moon always keeps the same face to the Earth, these are planets that always, because they orbit very close to their stars, because the star in this case, if you're living on the planet, is probably very dim and very cool. So in order to be habitable, you have to be very close to the star to get enough energy from it. And so they're so close that they get gravitationally locked, and then so half the planet is always in light and half is always in dark, which creates a lot of interesting setting stuff. But it took me a little bit of reading to find a story that I liked that was set on a tidally locked world. And I found this set of Stephen Baxter novellas about a couple weird planets, and I was like, great, that goes there. And another late find was this fantastic book called A Darkling Sea by James L. Cambias that I was just looking for like other weird kinds of alien people, and that's set on a planet that has like a subsurface ocean, sort of like Europa or Titan would, like under like a mile of ice. And there are humans who are visiting and some other aliens, but the native aliens are basically like sentient crustaceans, and they communicate with sonar, but they communicate and they see with it's so cool. It's such a fun book that I like. Just the sci-fi subreddit was a big help. They don't know this, but I was like trawling in there and like, are there any stories about aliens that don't have people in them? I'm just curious. But otherwise it was, of the books that I write about, some of them are books I've known and loved for a long time. Others I read for this and was like, great, that'll go in. But I knew the structure of the book right from the beginning, that it would be like the origin of life, planets, animals, which became evolution really, people, technology, and then making contact. So it was very easy to, like, they're big buckets. So I would just see like what fit in those buckets, and then I would see where I had gaps and, go to Reddit.
Favorite song on the Voyager record?
I don't have a favorite song on the Voyager record, but my favorite Star Trek theme song is Enterprise. Shannon, what was your question? Sorry, Molly, that song rocks.
I love that. I was going to ask you, is there anything that surprised you when you're writing the book, that you went in with expectations of, I know about these aliens, I know how I feel about how we imagine them, but at the end of it, did something really surprise you or make you feel like you saw this topic in a new perspective?
The question was there anything in the writing that surprised me and made me see the topic in a new way? So one of the interviews that I did was with an astrobiologist named Abel Mendez, who works at Arecibo. He's wonderful. And he's like started as an astrophysicist and learned more about astrobiology. And I was asking him like something about like, caring if there are aliens out there. And he's like, no, I don't care. I was like, what? You're an astrobiologist. And he was like, no, like the more I learn about it, the more I just appreciate life on Earth. And I was like, okay. And then like 2 months later, I found that I had fallen down that exact same path. So it's like, I like learning about the study of the origin of life and cellular biology, and just like there's this book I read by Nick Lane called The Vital Question that's about like how energy works in biology, and the way he describes ATP, which if you remember high school biology is I see people like, no I don't, is basically like the energy currency in the cell, and the incredible complexity of the molecules that just shuttle the electrons around to take, to create this little like energy coin that can be spent throughout the body was so mind-blowing and so amazing. And learning, like, I came into this as an astronomy person, but like learning so much more about evolution and biology and cellular biology, it like kind of turned me into a biology person, at least somewhat. And that really surprised me because like, biology's great, but it's like never been my thing. And I just left like really interested in all of that, which I did not see coming.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Oh, hello. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you, Leslie, for moderating this wonderful discussion. And thank you, of course, to Jamie for celebrating the class with us. So, first, I'm going to say if you're still with us on the YouTube live stream, you can click the link in the description to get a copy of The Possibility of Life. If you're here with us, we also have additional copies available for purchase at the desk where you checked in. Jamie is going to be signing and personalizing books at our little receiving desk. My coworker Pax is pointing right now to where that is. It's a little bit hidden, so we're going to ask that you all just line up down the center aisle and kind of curve around. Please make sure to grab all of your personal belongings with you so that we can start to rearrange the space. I think that's all. Let's give these two one last round of applause. Thank you so much.